If you ask the typical grad student, how do we get the modern Egyptian chronology? He wouldn't give you a very good answer. But today, we are going to explore how modern chronology actually works. Students are very rarely given expansive training in Egyptian chronology. This is why there's so few experts in Egyptian chronology in the field. The most intuitive method of building a chronology is what's called the additive method. It's sometimes called the building block or the ladder method as well. And essentially how it works is you take the reign of one king and you add it on top of another, and so on and so on and so on, and just add up the number of the years each king reigned until you get the dates that you need. And a lot of chronologists use this, both good and incompetent chronologists. It does work in a very local sense. So it's one of those things where it is used, but it has limits. Anyway, let's take an example of this and let's look at one particular chronology. So what we do is we have a king with whom there is an established date. Then you add your next king, followed by your next, and so on until you build up an entire chronology. And the additive method works reasonably well with short chronological sequences, such as if you're calculating the reigns of a well-known dynasty where the reign lengths of each king are well-known and well-established, the additive method works just fine. Unfortunately, chronology isn't always so tidy. Sometimes there's ambiguity with how long a king reigned. For example, we're often presented with a date range for a particular king. For example, Seti I is often said to have reigned between 11 and 15 years. How do we account for this ambiguity? Let's try to use the additive method with a fictitious King John and see what we get. So we take our fictitious King John and we say he reigned 3 to 5 years. And let's say he was alive in 1000 BC. When we calculate the possible dates for King John, we end up with 4 possible date ranges. Now, that's okay for one king. But what happens if we have a second king with ambiguous dating? If we add a second king to fictitious King John, again with the same date range, we now have 6 possible ranges for that second king. So the ambiguity adds up upon itself, and the additive method becomes less useful as kings lists get more and more complicated. So if we can't rely on the additive method, what can we use that will help us overcome these limitations? We've already seen in a previous video that archaeoastronomy is not very useful. And the reason why archaeoastronomy doesn't help us is because we can't rely on the accuracy or the reference point of the original ancient observer. So that doesn't really help us. How then do modern chronologists get around this problem? The answer is the synchronism. The synchronism is the paramount tool used today by modern chronologists. What is a synchronism? A synchronism is a piece of information that ties two people as living together at the same time. It can be in the form of a letter, a contract, a marriage agreement, a stela, or even in the form of a royal gift. And we see all of these examples in the archaeological record that can tie two kings as being contemporary to each other. With a synchronism, you can establish a date for a king in the middle of a king's list, and then fill out the dates in both other directions by using the additive method. However, with synchronisms, complexity can still creep in, and it can be difficult sometimes to recognize which synchronisms are most significant. Until recently, most chronologists created their chronologies by hand. But what they had to do in order to make their chronologies is make a value judgment as to which synchronisms were most important. But the problem is that it isn't always intuitive which synchronisms are most important. Computer analytics has shown that some surprisingly obscure and unremarkable synchronisms were indeed more important than others. Let's take, for example, the chronology between the Hittite Empire and Ugarit. Chronologists in the past have selected the synchronism between Supiluma II and Amurapi, plus Supiluma I and Nikmadu II as their primary synchronisms for dating the Hittites and Ugarit. But computer analytics has shown that actually the synchronisms between Tudalia IV and Amittamru II and Mursili II with Nikmepa are actually more important. And the reason they are more important is because these synchronisms act as limiters. Now, what is a limiter? A limiter is a synchronism that prevents two kings lists from moving in respect to each other, relative to each other. And you can see in the graphic here how those two synchronisms prevent the movement of the kings list. They actually are more important for establishing the chronology of both the Hittites and the kings of Ugarit than the synchronisms that have been traditionally selected by chronologists who did their work by hand. Now, the importance of limiters to doing a chronology is not just that they lock up these two, but limiters exist across the ancient Near East. So what happens is, if you have enough of these limiters, that the entire chronology of the ancient Near East locks up in place. So it limits how much movement a chronology can have. Furthermore, second-degree synchronisms can create an extended inconsistency effect. Now, what an extended inconsistency effect is that you could make a change to a chronology, and because of the way it works with the limiters, it might look good for the particular, let's say you change a king reign in Egypt. Okay, that might look good. But then the synchronism then has to also agree with what happens in, say, the Hittite Empire or Assyria. That can affect the dating that happens in Assyria, which then affects or creates an inconsistency with another king list down the road, perhaps maybe Babylon or Mari. It's not immediately apparent from your initial change, your proposed change, that this effect that it can have 2 or 3 degrees separation away from the change. This is extended inconsistency effect, and you can only detect it by computer analytics. So what happens is that the more synchronisms you use in calculating a chronology, and the more kings involved, the more accurate the chronology, but also the more complicated its calculation. It requires hundreds of thousands of calculations. And it's really beyond any human to be able to do this. Hence, the best chronologies done today are done by computer analytics. Computers can account for more synchronisms than the human being can. It can do more number crunching than a human being can. It can detect errors that human beings cannot detect. And overall, computers are now producing vastly superior chronologies than were done in the past. An example of such a piece of software that can do this kind of work is the Groundhog Test Laboratory, which is a program, a computer lab more or less, that can take King's lists and synchronisms and calculate a chronology and test it for internal consistency. This is why the best chronologies of the 1960s, and as I dare say, even the 1990s, no longer make the grade. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something and you found this interesting. And I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.